In 1942, as the United States mobilized for a global war, its military remained rigidly segregated. Black Americans were called to defend freedom overseas, yet denied full citizenship at home. Jim Crow laws governed daily life in the South, and discrimination shaped opportunity across the nation. Inside the U.S. Army, policy reflected the same prejudice. Black soldiers were placed in separate units, led mostly by white officers, and often assigned to labor battalions rather than combat roles. Many senior commanders believed African American troops lacked the intelligence, discipline, or courage for modern warfare. But the war demanded manpower. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Army expanded at unprecedented speed. Under pressure from civil rights organizations, black newspapers, and leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, the War Department reluctantly authorized the creation of black armored units. Armored warfare was among the most technical branches in the Army. Tanks required coordination, mechanical skill, and split-second decision-making. To many officials, the idea of black tank crews was unthinkable. Yet, in April 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, the U.S. Army activated the 761st Tank Battalion. It would become one of the first African-American armored units in American history. The men who reported for duty came from cities and small towns across the country: Detroit, Chicago, New York, rural Alabama, and Mississippi. Some were college students. Others were factory workers or farmhands. All wore the same uniform, though they knew they would not be treated the same as white soldiers. Training began under the hot Louisiana sun. The battalion learned to operate the M5 Stuart light tank before later transitioning to the heavier M4 Sherman. They studied gunnery, radio communication, engine repair, and battlefield maneuver. Tank warfare required trust. 5 men sealed inside steel, dependent on one another for survival. Driver, gunner, loader, assistant driver, commander, each role mattered. Mistakes could mean fire, explosion, or death. But beyond mastering machinery, the soldiers faced humiliation. Local segregation laws restricted where they could eat, sleep, or sit on a bus. On base, white officers sometimes questioned their competence. Promotions came slowly. Training resources were not always equal. The message, spoken and unspoken, was clear: you must prove yourselves worthy. The battalion adopted a motto: "Come out fighting." It was more than a slogan. It was a promise to themselves and to a country that doubted them. They trained relentlessly. Reports from inspectors began to change tone. Evaluations described discipline, sharp gunnery scores, mechanical proficiency. The men of the 761st were not asking for special treatment. They were asking for a chance. In 1943, the unit moved to Camp Hood, Texas, for advanced armored exercises. There, tensions sometimes erupted. One widely reported incident involved future baseball legend Jackie Robinson, who was assigned to the 761st for a time before transferring. Robinson refused to move to the back of an Army bus on base and faced court-martial charges, though he was later acquitted. His experience reflected the contradiction of the era. Black soldiers trained to fight fascism abroad while confronting racism within their own ranks. Despite obstacles, the battalion's performance steadily improved. Tank crews conducted live-fire drills, navigated obstacle courses, and rehearsed coordinated assaults with infantry units. Officers who had initially doubted them began to acknowledge their readiness. Still, deployment orders did not come. Other armored units shipped out to Europe. The 761st remained stateside, waiting. Some feared the Army would never send them into combat, that they would be kept as a political symbol
rather than a fighting force. The waiting was its own burden. Letters from home spoke of racial violence and limited opportunity. Newspapers carried stories of lynchings and discrimination. The men understood the irony. They were preparing to fight fascism abroad while confronting racism within their own ranks. Yet morale did not collapse. Shared hardship forged unity. Tank crews became families. They joked, argued, studied manuals late into the night. They competed to achieve the highest gunnery scores. By early 1944, Allied forces were preparing for the invasion of Western Europe. Casualties were mounting overseas. The demand for trained armored replacements grew urgent. At last, the call came. The 761st Tank Battalion would deploy to England in the fall of 1944. After more than 2 years of preparation, their moment had arrived. As they boarded transport ships, many felt a mixture of pride and resolve. They were about to test themselves in the most brutal theater of war. They carried not only rifles and ammunition, but expectation, the weight of proving wrong every voice that had questioned their ability. If they failed, critics would say the experiment had failed. If they succeeded, they would open doors for those who followed. The story of the 761st began in segregation, doubt, and delay. But beneath those pressures, something powerful had formed: discipline, brotherhood, and determination. They were ready to show the world and their own country what they could do.
By the fall of 1944, the men of the 761st Tank Battalion had waited more than 2 years for the chance to fight. They had trained in Louisiana and Texas, endured insults and skepticism, and watched other units ship overseas. Now, at last, they crossed the Atlantic. The journey to Europe was quiet but heavy with expectation. Many understood that this deployment would determine not only their own fate, but the future of black combat units in the U.S. Army. They arrived first in England, where Allied forces were staging reinforcements after the D-Day landings. The invasion of Normandy had begun in June 1944, and the fight across France was fierce and costly. The 761st continued final preparations, tank maintenance, live fire drills, coordination exercises. Their equipment was checked and rechecked. The M4 Sherman tanks they operated were reliable, but vulnerable to German heavy armor. Survival would depend on teamwork, mobility, and precision. In October 1944, the battalion landed in France. The sound of distant artillery was constant. The air carried the smell of fuel, mud, and smoke. War was no longer theoretical. Ruined villages lined the roads. Civilians moved carefully through shattered streets. The men of the 761st understood that everything they had practiced would now be tested under fire. Soon after arriving, they were attached to the 3rd Army under the command of General George S. Patton. Patton was one of America's most aggressive and controversial commanders. Known for his discipline and bold tactics, he demanded speed and relentless attack. He had also expressed doubts about black soldiers earlier in the war. Yet the pressure of combat often reshaped opinions more quickly than policy ever could. Before committing them to battle, Patton addressed the battalion. He reportedly told them he did not care what color they were, only that they fight well. It was not a promise of equality, it was a challenge. The message was clear: performance would be their only shield against prejudice. Their first major combat operations began in the Lorraine region of northeastern France in November 1944. The terrain was difficult: dense forests, rolling hills, narrow roads that funneled tanks into dangerous positions. German forces were experienced and well entrenched. Anti-tank guns were concealed along tree lines. Mines were buried beneath muddy fields. Every advance risked ambush. When the 761st moved forward for the first time, the tension inside each tank was electric. 5 men enclosed in steel, hearing only engine noise and radio commands, scanning for threats. Then came the crack of enemy fire.
Shells burst against armor, machine gun rounds struck metal with sharp metallic pings. Training took over. Gunners returned fire, drivers maneuvered for cover, commanders issued rapid instructions through headsets thick with static. Losses came quickly. War did not pause to evaluate fairness. Some tanks were disabled by mines, others were knocked out by German anti-tank weapons. Casualties were real and immediate. Yet the battalion did not retreat. They pressed forward, clearing villages and supporting infantry advances. Reports from the front noted their determination and coordination under pressure. White infantry units that had initially doubted them began to change their tone. On the battlefield, competence was undeniable. The 761st provided armored support during assaults on fortified towns, blasting enemy strongpoints and protecting exposed soldiers advancing on foot. Tank crews often operated with limited visibility, relying on trust and instinct. Communication between units improved as shared danger replaced suspicion. Cold autumn rain turned roads into rivers of mud. Maintenance crews worked through the night repairing damaged tracks and engines. Sleep was short, food was scarce. Still, the battalion maintained operational readiness. They were no longer an experiment, they were a combat unit in active operations. Each engagement chipped away at old assumptions. Performance reports grew increasingly positive. Officers observed discipline under fire and tactical awareness equal to other armored battalions. The men of the 761st were not just proving that black soldiers could handle tanks, they were proving they could fight, adapt, and endure in one of the most complex forms of modern warfare. Yet prejudice did not disappear overnight. Some skepticism lingered in rear headquarters. Supplies were not always prioritized, recognition was limited. But at the front lines, results spoke louder than bias. As November turned toward December, German resistance stiffened. Intelligence reports warned of a potential counteroffensive. Winter approached, and with it one of the most decisive battles of the European war. The proving ground was over. The real test, the crucible that would define their legacy, was about to begin. By December 1944, winter had tightened its grip on Europe. Snow covered the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, muffling sound and hiding danger beneath white silence. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion had already been in near-constant combat for weeks. They were exhausted, short on replacements, and operating far from the comfort of rear supply lines. Then, on December 16th, German forces launched a massive counteroffensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan was bold and desperate. Adolf Hitler aimed to split Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. Elite German units, including armored divisions equipped with heavy Tiger and Panther tanks, struck through the Ardennes forest. American lines bent under the surprise attack. Entire units were overrun. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles and civilians fleeing advancing troops. General George S. Patton responded with speed. His Third Army pivoted north in one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the war. Among the units ordered into the frozen chaos was the 761st Tank Battalion. They would help blunt the German advance and relieve surrounded American forces. The weather was brutal. Temperatures plunged below freezing. Engines struggled to start in the mornings. Tank crews chipped ice from hatches before climbing inside steel halls that felt like refrigerators. Frostbite was a constant threat. Snow concealed mines. Visibility dropped in swirling storms, yet operations did not pause. Inside a Sherman tank during combat, the world shrank to noise and vibration. The driver focused on narrow forest roads slick with ice. The gunner scanned tree lines for the flash of enemy fire. The loader moved with urgency, sliding shells into place. The commander listened to radio transmissions layered with static and shouted coordinates. When German anti-tank guns opened fire, there was often only seconds to react. The 761st fought through towns whose names were difficult to pronounce but impossible to forget. Tillet, Bastogne approaches, small villages reduced to rubble by artillery. They supported infantry assaults, blasted fortified positions, and engaged enemy armor at close range. German tanks often had thicker armor and more powerful guns. The Shermans relied on speed, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated attacks. Victory required precision and courage. Casualties mounted, tanks were hit and burned, crews bailed out into gunfire and snow. Some did not escape in time. Replacement vehicles arrived, but experienced crewmen could not be replaced as easily. Despite losses, the battalion remained in action. Their service during the winter offensive became part of a larger record: 183 consecutive days in combat without being pulled from the line. Few units endured such sustained engagement. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep came in brief, uneasy moments between missions. The sound of artillery never truly faded. Letters from home arrived sporadically. News of segregation and racial violence in America contrasted sharply with the unity demanded on the battlefield. In combat, survival depended on trust between tank crews and the infantry units they supported. Prejudice had little place when enemy shells were incoming. White infantry soldiers who once doubted them now requested their support by name. Reports described the 761st as aggressive and reliable under fire. In one engagement, tank crews advanced through heavy resistance to destroy enemy gun positions blocking an American push forward. In another, they held defensive lines long enough for reinforcements to arrive, preventing a breakthrough. Their actions were not symbolic, they were tactical contributions that saved lives. Winter warfare tested equipment and endurance. Fuel lines froze, tracks snapped under stress. Maintenance teams worked in darkness with numb fingers, repairing damage so tanks could return to battle by dawn. Medics treated wounds in improvised shelters. Chaplains offered quiet words before crews rolled back into contested territory. Every day demanded resilience. By January 1945, the German offensive had stalled. Allied forces regained momentum, pushing the enemy back across the Ardennes. The cost was staggering on both sides. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States during World War II. The 761st had been there in the freezing forests, holding the line when collapse seemed possible. But their fight did not end with the German retreat. As Allied forces advanced into Germany itself, resistance remained fierce. The battalion continued operations across rivers and through fortified towns. The pattern persisted: advance, engage, repair, move again. Day after day, week after week. 183 days in continuous combat is not simply a statistic. It is a measure of endurance carved in cold steel and human will. It meant facing death repeatedly and still climbing back into a tank the next morning. It meant carrying the weight of expectation, that failure would confirm prejudice, while success might begin to dismantle it. By early spring 1945, the 761st had established a record equal to any armored unit in the European theater. Their courage under relentless pressure had silenced many doubters at the front. They had fought through snow, fire, and fear, and as Allied forces pushed deeper into the heart of Nazi Germany, the Black Panthers were still moving forward, engines roaring, motto intact. They had come out fighting, and they had not stopped.
By early 1945, the momentum of the war had shifted decisively. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Cities lay in ruins. Bridges were destroyed behind fleeing units. Yet even in collapse, resistance remained dangerous. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion continued their advance eastward, pushing across the German frontier with the rest of the Allied armies. The landscape had changed. The forests of the Ardennes gave way to shattered towns and industrial centers scarred by bombing. Civilians emerged cautiously from basements and cellars, uncertain whether the approaching tanks meant destruction or deliverance. For the 761st, the mission remained clear: advance, engage, secure. But as they moved deeper into Germany, the meaning of the war began to take on a sharper, more personal clarity. During the spring offensive, the battalion supported infantry divisions as they breached defensive lines along rivers and highways leading towards central Germany and Austria. German troops, though weakened, still fought fiercely in pockets. Anti-tank weapons were hidden among factory ruins. Snipers waited in church towers. Every intersection could conceal danger. Inside their Shermans, tank crews operated with the efficiency forged by months of continuous combat. Drivers maneuvered through debris-strewn streets. Gunners targeted fortified windows and barricades. Loaders moved with practiced rhythm. Commanders coordinated over radio channels, crowded with urgent voices. The fear that had once felt sharp and overwhelming had settled into something colder, focused determination. Then came moments that would stay with them forever. As Allied forces overran German territory, concentration camps and forced labor sites were discovered. The full scale of Nazi brutality became visible in ways that could not be denied. Emaciated prisoners, skeletal and exhausted, stood behind barbed wire. Some could barely lift their heads as American tanks rolled past the gates. For black soldiers who had grown up under segregation, the sight carried a complex weight. They had known discrimination and humiliation at home. They had been told they were inferior. Yet here they witnessed the industrialized horror of a regime built on racial ideology taken to its extreme conclusion. The liberation of these camps reinforced why the war had to be won. The 761st participated in securing areas surrounding several labor and prison camps during the final push into Austria and southern Germany. Medics and support personnel assisted in stabilizing survivors until medical teams could take over. Tank crews who had grown hardened to combat found themselves shaken by what they saw. War had always been brutal, but this revealed a cruelty beyond the battlefield. As April turned to May, German resistance began to collapse entirely. Supply lines disintegrated, surrenders became more frequent. Columns of captured soldiers marched under guard. The once feared Wehrmacht now appeared exhausted and fragmented. Rumors spread quickly through Allied ranks. Berlin was encircled. Hitler was dead. The end was imminent. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, was declared. The guns in the European theater fell silent. For the first time in 183 days of continuous combat, the men of the 761st were not preparing for another engagement. There was relief, certainly. Some celebrated quietly. Others simply sat beside their tanks, absorbing the stillness. They had traveled hundreds of miles across hostile territory. They had fought through the Battle of the Bulge, advanced into the German heartland, and remained operational despite heavy casualties. Their performance matched that of any armored battalion in the theater. Official reports confirmed their combat effectiveness. Officers who had once doubted them now acknowledged their discipline and courage. Yet victory carried complicated emotions. They had proven themselves in the most demanding conditions imaginable. They had risked and lost lives for a country that still segregated their families at home. The contradiction lingered even in triumph. As occupation duties began, the 761st assisted in stabilizing captured territories and guarding prisoners. The tempo slowed, but the reality of war's aftermath surrounded them. Displaced civilians, destroyed infrastructure, lingering tension. Letters from home resumed more regularly. Families wrote about hope for change after the war. Many Black Americans believed that service and sacrifice would accelerate the struggle for civil rights. When orders finally came to return to the United States, anticipation was mixed with uncertainty. What would await them? Would their record in Europe translate to respect at home? They had worn the uniform with distinction. They had fulfilled every expectation placed upon them and shattered those rooted in prejudice. Ships carried them back across the Atlantic, away from battlefields where they had left friends behind. Some veterans reflected on the journey from segregated training camps to liberated European towns. They entered the war doubted. They left it proven warriors. But as trains carried them south toward hometowns, still governed by Jim Crow laws, it became clear that another struggle remained. Uniforms did not erase discrimination. Medals did not guarantee equality. The applause that greeted white units was often muted or absent for them. The 761st Tank Battalion helped secure victory in Europe. They had fought tyranny abroad and witnessed the consequences of racial hatred taken to its most horrific extreme. They returned home as liberators, yet still faced the limitations of segregation. The war in Europe was over. For these men, the fight for recognition and justice was only beginning.
When the men of the 761st Tank Battalion returned home in 1945, they did so without parades or national headlines. Europe had seen them as liberators. America saw them as Black veterans in a segregated society. Uniforms were folded away, medals were stored in drawers. The country they had defended resumed its old habits. In the South, Jim Crow laws still dictated where they could eat, vote, or attend school. In the North, discrimination took quieter but equally limiting forms: restricted housing, unequal employment, barriers to education. The GI Bill promised opportunity, yet access was often filtered through local systems that marginalized Black veterans. Some found work in factories, others returned to farms or small businesses. Many rarely spoke about what they had endured overseas. Part of the silence was personal. Combat memories were heavy. Friends had been lost in burning tanks and frozen forests. The horrors of liberated camps lingered in quiet moments. But another silence was institutional. Official histories of World War II rarely mentioned the 761st. Textbooks highlighted famous divisions and celebrated commanders, yet the sustained combat record of the Black Panthers faded into footnotes. The narrative of the war centered on unity and triumph. Acknowledging the segregation within the U.S. Army complicated that story. For decades, the contributions of African American combat units received limited recognition. While white units were memorialized in film and literature, the 761st remained largely unknown outside veteran circles and Black communities. Yet the men did not forget. They held reunions, they shared photographs and letters, they preserved their motto, "Come out fighting." Some joined veterans organizations, others became active in early civil rights efforts, drawing a clear line between their service abroad and the demand for equality at home. They had faced German armor in the Ardennes. They were not intimidated by poll taxes or segregated buses. The broader civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s reshaped the national conversation. As legal segregation was challenged and dismantled, historians and journalists began to re-examine overlooked chapters of the war. Questions surfaced. Why had Black combat units received so little attention? Why had their awards and commendations lagged behind their records? In 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the U.S. Armed Forces.
It was a landmark decision, influenced in part by the demonstrated performance of units like the 761st. Though change did not happen overnight, the order marked a formal shift in policy. The courage displayed in Europe helped expose the contradiction of a segregated military fighting for democracy. Recognition, however, moved slowly. Decades passed before comprehensive reviews of military records addressed disparities in awards. Veterans of the 761st aged. Some passed away without seeing their service publicly honored. Families preserved their stories privately, waiting for a wider audience. In 1978, more than 30 years after the guns fell silent in Europe, the battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. It was a significant acknowledgement, but it came late. The ceremony brought pride and bittersweet reflection. Many original members were no longer alive to stand beside their comrades. Further review of individual records continued. In 1997, more than half a century after World War II ended, one member of the battalion, Vernon Baker, received the Medal of Honor for his actions in April 1945. Baker had led a daring assault against entrenched German positions despite heavy fire. His recognition symbolized not only personal bravery, but also the long overdue acknowledgement of systemic bias in award recommendations. Several other African American soldiers from World War II were honored that same year after similar reviews. The delay raised difficult questions. How many acts of heroism had gone underreported? How many recommendations had stalled due to prejudice rather than merit? The story of the 761st became part of a larger reckoning within the U.S. military, an effort to confront inequities embedded in its history. As the 20th century closed, documentaries, books, and academic studies began restoring the battalion to its rightful place in the narrative of World War II. Surviving veterans spoke on camera, their voices steady but reflective. They described the cold of the Ardennes, the thunder of artillery, the pride of proving doubters wrong. They also spoke about returning home to a nation not yet ready to fully accept them. Their legacy extended beyond military achievement. The 761st demonstrated that competence and courage were not limited by race. Their record weakened the argument for segregation in the armed forces. Young soldiers of every background who served in later conflicts did so in a military formally committed to integration, a reality shaped in part by the example set decades earlier. Today, memorials and museums include their story. Scholars teach their history in classrooms that once overlooked them. Descendants carry photographs of men in tank helmets standing beside Shermans in the snow. The nickname Black Panthers no longer fades into obscurity. It stands as a symbol of resilience. 50 years of silence did not erase what they accomplished. It only delayed recognition. The steel tracks they left across Europe were matched by an invisible path carved through American history, a path toward inclusion, accountability, and remembrance. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion fought two wars. One ended in 1945 with victory in Europe. The other, against erasure and inequality, lasted decades longer. Through persistence, testimony, and the eventual acknowledgement of a grateful nation, their story emerged from the shadows. They had come out fighting, and in the end, history finally answered.